Behind the Laughs now on BBC Two, Ben Elton kicks off a new series of Face to Face.
Ben Elton, hugely successful stand-up comic, writer of most enjoyable comedies, the young ones, Blackadder, The Thin Blue Line, of plays, of novels. Which do you prefer, writing or performing?
To me, performing is an extension of writing. Everything for me starts with the words, the writing. I write my act. Just as I write a novel, or I co-write some of the sitcoms you've talked about, or write them on my own or whatever. And then once one's on stage, having learnt the act and knowing it, then of course there's an extra process of writing, the improvisation, which is sort of writing on the spur of the moment, not with a pen, but just with one's mouth. You know? And so it's all, I'm on stage because of what I've got to say, rather than because I'm looking for ways to be naturally funny. I'm not a kind of clown. It's the content of the work. So you asked me which I prefer. I like them all, and I'm in the tremendously privileged position that I can sort of chop and change and choose my format. And if I've been on the road for a long time, I say, right, well, I'll put the writing and the performing of stand-up comedy away, and I'll write a novel or something. So it's all writing, and I enjoy it all.
Which is the easier part of it?
What, you mean writing or performing? Well, neither of them are easy. I think they both have attendant pleasures and attendant difficulties. I've never tried to quantify, you know, how rough a job is, because sometimes it's, I think as in any vocation, if you're lucky enough to do the job you want to do, although you have bad days, you know, on the whole it's everything. The bad days are part of the good days. You know that you can't have a moment when the improvisation flows and suddenly words seem to leap out the ends of your fingers and you don't really know where they came from. You can't have those moments without the drudgery of nothing coming and sitting there and facing the blank screen or paper or whatever. And likewise on stage, you can't have, again, the moment where you fly, where it really does become a very splendid thing to be able to just improvise a line. But that can never come, for me anyway, unless you're improvising from strength, i.e. you know solidly what your routine is, what your attitude is, what the comic motivation is behind what you're doing. So the drudgery and the moments of flight are all kind of part of each other. So it's neither easy nor difficult, it's just what it is.
Is the improvisation a tiny part of the act or a sizable part of the act?
In its initial sense, it's the whole act, because writing is an improvisation. To me, sitting alone, obviously you're teasing ideas, you've got time to go back and look over them, etc. But nonetheless, the best moments come from a sort of unknown, an unknown point at which the words start to flow. Woody Allen put it brilliantly when he said, it's a sentence I wish I'd said. He said, when I write a joke, I'm hearing it for the first time. And I emphasize that very, very deeply, because you don't really know where it comes from, and you can't explain why you think it might work. You just have to risk it. So, as I say, the act is an improvisation from the start. But if you mean once I've decided, once it's pretty much a transcript, how much from that point on is improvised? Difficult to say, not very much. You know, if I said, I mean, 5% would be enormous. I mean, that would be a splendid night. If I came off stage and said, well, 5% of the act was absolutely new tonight. It has happened. It would be an extraordinary night. And other nights I'd say, well, nothing really new happened tonight, except I recreated the material. Please don't get me wrong. Don't think I perform the act by rote. I simply recite it, and I turn myself on at the beginning and finish at the end, and if something new occurs, that's a bonus. That's not the case at all. Every night you recreate those thoughts, because it's a process of communication. And as anyone who's sought to put their point across, be it in a pub, in a lecture theatre or whatever, or just try to sort of pull someone or whatever, they know that you might be using the same old line, but if you don't mean it, it's not going to work. And I had an experience once where very early on in my career, I was sort of thought, oh, I can just do this. And in fact, it was the only time in my life I've ever had a useful heckle. In that somebody, I used to have a little conversational tick in that I say, it's the truth, it's the truth. Anyway, I'm walking down the street, it's the truth. You know, one of those awful, you know what I mean type of commas that unfortunately normally ends up being a swear word, but a conversational tick that a comedian will stand behind. Somebody shouted, you keep saying it's the truth, but obviously it isn't. And it was brilliant, because although it was sort of the truth, I'd forgotten why it was true, and I was just the. So in a way, it's still an improvisation, even though I know the act off by heart. I don't know if that makes any sense, but anyway, that's the answer.
Do you ever improvise and find it doesn't work?
Actually, that's quite rare, because the flight of fancy takes place because of what's happening in the room, and I'm good at that. That's what I do.
By the room, you mean you and a couple of thousand people?
Yes, but there is a communication. When I say a couple of thousand people, they're all individuals. I don't like the word crowd. I really worked that crowd. I was on top of the crowd. I controlled the crowd. To me, the crowd is a group of individuals, every bit as original as I hope I am, and as interested. And it's my job to communicate with them. It's a dialogue. It's just very one way. And if I do kind of fly off the text, and it is a text, I mean it's typed up, it tends to work because I wouldn't have flown off it if I wasn't feeling that way. I mean, it's like when you're on a roll conversationally, you know, everyone's had that feeling of, you know, being in the pub and actually being very, you know, funny, and there's just something happens, and for some reason it's their turn, the muse is on them. But yeah, occasionally one can, you know, gets a whiff of embalming fluid from the wings, but I've never had something just kind of sag so deeply that I haven't been able to drag it back out.
In the sitcoms that you write, you're creating comic characters. When you're on stage performing, it's you. Are you trying to tell us something when you're up there making us laugh?
I don't think tell you something. Well, yes, tell you something, tell you what I feel, which is very different from telling you what I think you should feel. And this is where I feel I've been misunderstood, although I don't think I can blame the people who've misunderstood me, because I haven't put myself across well enough. But what I'm trying to do is express myself, to say I have a comic take on this, and sometimes that comic take includes a moral take, because the comedy comes from a sense of moral outrage or of intellectual outrage. An example I often give is the difference between the experience of driving a car in a car advert and the experience of driving a car in reality. And I mean, the distance is so chasmic as to be, to me, funny on a very ordinary, mundane sense, and funny on a kind of global environmental sense. You know, we all know, I see these car ads, and the thing that's always very clear is that they're very happy, they're very smug, there's a good-looking guy, good-looking girl, they're driving along, they're so happy. Why aren't they happy? Because they're happy. There's no other cars on the road. Now, that's a unique experience. I'd be happy. I mean, they keep telling me what's the car, it's a Ford, it's a Honda. Just tell me where the road is. I'd like to drive on an empty road. So to me, there's an outrage there, there's a moral point, but I'm not telling you, you know, more public transport or whatever, although I was guilty occasionally of a bit of, you know, politicising in my day, but I've learnt that that's not a very good idea in a stand-up act. I'm just telling you what I feel, and if a moral point comes out of that, then you can take it or leave it, but, you know, it is at least an honest point from me.
It's some years on now from the young ones, and Thin Blue Line, say, is sort of milder and mellower than your earlier stabs at writing comedy. Are you milder and mellower?
No, I think I'm the same as I've always been. I don't feel I've changed at all. I think most people don't feel they've changed. I think we all sort of think we're still sort of students or young people and are kind of slightly surprised. That's why everyone, things like being 40, you actually have to think, God, what did I... It's always the same. I used to think 40-year-olds were very old, and now I'm 40, I suppose I ought to feel old, but I don't, sort of thing, or at least I wished I didn't, or whatever. I don't think I've changed at all, and I don't think Thin Blue Line was mellower. It certainly was less loud and less kind of jagged. I mean, The Young Ones was very early. It was a co-written project, and that was its charm and also its weakness, in that we all threw in stuff, and so that gave it a marvellous anything can happen feel, and also that meant there were some bits that were crap. Thin Blue Line has some, yes, I mean, it's got less, it's less loud, but I think there's as many ideas in it. If you listen to Inspector Fowler's desperate attempts to kind of take his 1950s sensibilities into the 90s, I think that's quite thought-provoking. But then again, I've written you know, gentle stuff all my life. I mean, I did routines about the inside of my fridge, which were just about being a sad student. That was one of the first things I ever wrote, and I thought it was pretty gentle.
But at the start of the 80s, you and others were thought of as alternative comedians. Brasher, younger, ruder, noisier than others. I mean, are you still an alternative comedian?
Well, people used to say, oh, what does that mean? I mean, it was coined by a group called the Alternative Cabaret, Andy de la Tour, Tony Allen, Jim Barclay, and it was a good phrase. It basically meant, really, non-sexist, non-racist cabaret. Now, that might sound very pious now and terribly politically correct, a term that we're all heartily sick of. And yet, at the time, it was very relevant. You know, I think we're sort of all very relaxed now about the idea that one is aware that one can be sexist in one's language and one wants to watch that. I mean, I think everyone is aware. What's happening in comedy is different. But there was a time when a change sort of was required, or at least some people felt it was. So alternative meant non-racist, non-sexist, I suppose, and some people might say that was pious and boring, and I don't think it was. I think exploring other areas of comedy was very useful and remains so, and I think actually the freedom that one is now able to make jokes about women's bodies, men's bodies, or whatever with, I think, a greater degree of equanimity is because certain battles, not many battles, but certain battles have been won. I think people do feel more relaxed about a more fair-minded racial and sexual balance in comedy.
Do you think there are things you can't be funny about?
No, there's no subject on earth that should be banned from comedy. But I believe personally there are attitudes that should be banned from comedy. Hence, the Holocaust, clearly a subject about which it would be difficult to be funny, but the idea that it's not possible to find humour in that, of course, would disenfranchise the victims of the Holocaust, because humour is an essential part of the human survival mechanism. So, firstly, the victims of a terrible thing are likely probably to find humour in it at some point as part of their methods of survival. And one can, I mean, I'd be very unlikely to ever write a comic routine around the Holocaust, but I, for instance, have done comic routines around our attitudes to AIDS, which to some people is a Holocaust. I mean, within the gay community, that term was used when people seem to be losing friends every day. And yet, although there's no comedy to me in large groups of people dying, there is comedy in the attitudes around it, the way the government was responding to it, etc. So I give those examples, and I gave it once, and I was rewarded with a headline saying, I can make jokes about AIDS, says Elton, which I think was rather deliberately misunderstanding me. But there's no subject which is out of bounds for the comedian, but for me personally, comedy, as with everything, should have a moral guidance. I think people should, you know, not say anything goes. They should ask themselves, how do I feel about this? And if they feel okay, then they can do it. So I make jokes about anything I feel like making jokes, and trust to my personal morality not to be offensive.
I think someone once described you as a sort of glib git in a smart suit or whatever.
Well, it was me, actually, and I've had to suffer for it ever since, in that I said once in an interview, I know I'm often seen as a smug git in a shiny suit, but I have got a shiny suit, but I don't think I'm smug. But ever since then, it's been, you used to call yourself, so that's where that came from.
How would you describe yourself now?
I don't try and describe myself. I'm not a remotely introspective or reflective person. The only time I'm thinking hard is when I'm talking or writing, when I'm improvising. I don't reflect privately. I don't meditate, and I tend not to ponder about things. My private thoughts are often just fantasies. As I'm walking along, I might be accepting an Oscar or climbing Everest or winning a war or whatever, you know, sort of.
Well, those are quite significant fantasies.
Yes, or not, or simply going for a good. I don't have major power fantasies. I occasionally do. My favourite fantasy is imagining I've written all Lennon and McCartney's songs, you know. I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone in that fantasy.
Do you like the way you look?
I don't dislike it. As I say, I don't think about myself. I'm not. That is not a vanity I have. I may be proud of, you know, I've got some vanity in that I'm very proud that people like my work. But I don't push myself forward. I could have done a lot more television than I have done. I mean, I could appear a lot more and do other things. I tend to work privately. I write for other people because as a writer, the privilege of having Rick Mayall or Rowan Atkinson performing one's work is such a kind of, one could wait all one's life for that, and yet it's something that's happened to me on a regular basis, and I don't push myself forward, so I don't think I'm physically vain, and you can probably understand why.
You suffer from an illness which is uncomfortable, psoriasis. Is that a problem for you? Does that make life very difficult or not?
It was. Psoriasis, I think it's a condition. I don't know whether it's incurable. Perhaps the worst thing about having an incurable condition is that everybody's got a cure. Once something becomes, once a cure is discovered, of course, there's nothing more to discuss. But if there is no cure, then everyone has one. There's a cream, there's a herb, there's an alternative, whatever. And that can become rather tiresome in that everyone's got a cousin who's got this great cream and let me write it down for you, which is, of course, very well meant, but you sort of don't want to talk about psoriasis all the time. I've been very fortunate that eventually I discovered a treatment called PUVA, psoriasis UVA, which is a light treatment. You're basically treated by a kind of an intense form of false sunlight. And that helped me a lot, and I discovered that a few years ago, and that keeps it suppressed. There was a time about 4 years ago when I did just begin to think, oh, hang on, this is going beyond an irritation and into something which might almost be called a sort of very minor disability. One began to have the little fantasies which I believe are quite common amongst sufferers of skin conditions of, I'd give a little finger to get rid of this. You begin to try and quantify how bad is this. And there was a time when it was quite bad, and when you sleep you feel it on your sheets and things like that. But it's got a lot better since then. It comes and it goes, but I mean it's a small cross to bear. I don't, it's not something I would dwell upon. I've mentioned it publicly because when kids have it, it can be physically, it can look bad, and before they discovered what it was, people used to think it was dreadful and catching because it doesn't look very nice. It's not catching. It's completely benign. And I think it's important, for people to sort of stand up and say, I've got it and it doesn't matter.
Where were you born?
I was born in Lewisham Hospital in South East London and went home to our house in Catford.
Who are your parents?
Well, my mother is now retired, but she was an English teacher, although she gave up English teaching for some time to bring up her 4 children, of which I was the youngest. And my father was a lecturer in physics at Battersea College of Technology. Then he was fortunate to get the chair of physics at what was, in the days when universities were expanding, what was Surrey University. It was a new university in the 60s. So we moved to Guildford when I was 9 because my dad took up a post at Surrey as in the chair of physics. He actually later changed his discipline to educational technology, the research into teaching methods, because I think he felt, a great deal is known and not so much known about how to teach. It's interesting that in order to teach a 4-year-old, you need to, 3 years training, but to teach a 19-year-old, you merely need to have passed the same degree that you're teaching the previous year. Interesting stuff. I don't really wish to speak for them because it's their business.
Are you close to them?
Very close. We're a close family.
Do they come to see your act?
Not obsessively. I mean, my dad, I think, enjoys it more than my mother. I mean, it's quite near the knuckle, my live act. It's not... the language is coarse. I hope it's clever, I hope it's interesting, but it's live, and I do swear too much, and I wished I didn't, and I am cutting down because it's boring. My mum gave me a good hint. She said, it sounds rather kind of schoolmarmy, but she gave it with a great sense of humour, which is that the F word is all very well as an exclamation mark, but it's not much use as a comma. And if you're F this, F that, or down the effing pub, and anyway, this effing bloke comes out to me and F's off and all that. And it's the subject matter I deal with, a great deal of, sexual, scatological, etc. That's the stuff of live stand-up comedy. And I think they appreciate what I do. But I mean, there's no reason why one's parents should love every, if you have a child who, if my wife and I are blessed with kids, and I have a kid who loves football, it's not going to make me love football anymore, but it won't make me love them any less that they like football.
What did you learn in your parents' home? What did it give you?
Well, everything. I mean, as I say, we're a close family. We still all, meet when we can, and particularly for Christmas. We always talked. There was one special time of day each day, which was tea time, 6 o'clock, where we, you know, the effort was always made. Dad was sometimes abroad and things because of his academic stuff, but we would always have sort of an hour together as a family around the tea table, all trying to get a word in. We're all talkers. I guess I had a splendid education both at school. I was educated at local state schools, and very, very good they were too, and at home around the tea table. Everything. It's an awful answer, but I can't
Your
think of a
father
better
was
one.
a refugee from Nazi Europe?
Yes, my father's family were originally German. He was born in Frankfurt. They weren't actually in Germany during the 30s because my grandfather took up a post at Prague University, a professor of ancient history in Prague, and so they went to Czechoslovakia in the late 20s. So they saw the rise of Hitler from Czechoslovakia, and it only became, well, obviously it was very significant for them politically, and we had a lot of family left in Germany, but for them it only became immediate after Munich. And perhaps because they were historians, my grandmother and grandfather kind of didn't do the regrettable thing that many did, which is to think it'll be all right, and they thought we've got to get out. They were very fortunate because of their academic connections. They were very lucky. There were people in Britain who were prepared to help them and look after them because of the international kind of community of academia. And so they were able to come to Britain in 1939. Yes, and then that's yes, he was a refugee.
Do you think that your speech is English, or is it Cockney?
Well, it's certainly English. I wouldn't call it Cockney by any means. It's an honest accent, but my voice changes. I mean, if I'm in a cab driver with someone who says, "All right, Ben," I tend to end up going, "All right, mate." You know, I mean, everyone has a telephone voice for various different situations.
But that's not how people talk in Guildford, is it?
Well, you'll be wrong about that. I mean, Guildford's a large southern English town. I mean, it's not filled with, you know, stockbrokers, etc. I mean, my mother taught at the local comprehensive school, and a very good one it was too. You know, there is no posh bits of England anymore. I mean, you know, we're a mix. I went to Stillness Primary School and junior school in southeast London, where I used to say southeast, but I've lost that. My accent's a natural one. It slightly annoys me. You know, people have said, "Oh, well, of course your father's a professor and a German Jewish refugee. How come you don't speak? You must put this on." People don't pick up the accents of their parents. They pick up the accents of the classroom because they need to fit in. You know, which is why, for instance, people of Asian descent, they don't speak like their parents. They pick up the local accent, or black people.
Was the house full of books?
Yeah, a lot of books. I mean, my parents weren't bookish. I mean, they weren't always
What is
pushing
it
us.
that started you wanting to write?
Well, there's a couple of interesting moments that I can remember. Something which I owe a lot to my parents, in that Mum always read us stories when we were little, and I really think that started my love of stories in a big way. I can remember, you know, listening to Animal Farm. I mean, and I've since learned that Animal Farm's the most wonderful book. I was inscribed it to a goddaughter of mine. This is a splendid book because you'll read it now when you're 11, and it'll be the best story you've ever read, and you'll read it again when perhaps you're 21, and it'll still be the best story, but it'll be a completely different story because, of course, one realizes it's a political allegory and it has much more in it. But the reading of stories, and when I was 11, I remember this. I can remember the moment my parents gave me P.G. Woodhouse's Eggs, Beans and Crumpets, because I used to read nothing but comics, and they didn't really mind, but, you know, they kind of wouldn't mind if I'd read a real book. They gave me Eggs, Beans and Crumpets, a P.G. Woodhouse book of short stories, and I absolutely fell in love with it and read almost nothing but P.G. Woodhouse for about 3 years after that. I guess it's around that time, I've often said, discovering the life of Coward. He died in '73, and there was a lot of talk about Coward at that time, and I just thought, what a glamorous and lovely life to have written plays, to have just spent your life making people laugh. And around that time, and getting into Amdram and doing a lot of amateur theatre, I just became very clear in my mind, absolutely certain in my mind, that I wanted to be an entertainer in comedy, and I have done that ever since.
And you wrote plays at university?
Yes, I've always written. I guess about the age of 11 or 12 I started to try and write. I mean, one isn't anything like so focused at that age, and so, 10 minutes seems like an hour. But I remember trying to write sketches for Morecambe and Wise, who were my great delight at that time, and Dad's Army, and trying to, as one tends to start off writing stuff that's already been written. You write the stuff that you like. I mean, I can remember writing stuff with Old Bean and Let's Have a Whiskey and S, and of course that's Woodhouse, and you've got an 11-year-old boy writing about 20s clubs and things. But slowly I kind of got the hang of it a little bit, and by the time I was 16 I was trying to write plays, and yes, I wrote quite a number of plays over the sort of 5 years between 16 and 21.
Did you want to be a stand-up comic?
No, being a stand-up comic was a pure circumstance, a practical circumstance. A very good move for me, it turned out, although in some ways bad because I became defined as such. I'm still comedian Ben Elton writes a novel, or comedian Ben Elton puts on a play, but that's okay, you can't, I'm not so pompous as to want to be novelist Ben Elton or whatever. But I became a comedian on 24th of February 1981, a very big day for me because it was so terrifying and so horrible. One of the worst sort of experiences, one can have outside something really bad, like illness or being beaten up or something, but, in a sort of peaceful sense, a pretty bad experience. Well, it was January 81. I'd left university a few months before. I'd just written a play about Mussolini, comedy, and it was getting rejected from the RSC and the fringe pubs alike, and I needed to make a living and I needed to get my material seen. This thing, alternative comedy, was just starting. There was 2 clubs only. There was a comic strip in the Comedy Store and the odd pub gig every now and then. And I just thought I must do something, and that nobody wanted my work except, bless him, Rick Mail, who was at that point inviting me in to join what was the Young Ones writing team, which was him, Lisa Mayer and myself. But nobody else wanted it, and I needed to try and make a living and get myself known. So I wrote myself a little stand-up act, auditioned at the comic strip for Pete Richardson, and to my great good fortune they gave me a little go, and I turned out to have a facility for it, mainly because my material was good. I wasn't very good as a comic. And I started to compare the Comedy Store very soon after that, through the summer of 81. And those were very unpleasant times. Those gigs were not nice. The audiences, on the whole, were very nice, but you only need 10 aggressive blokes to ruin it. It always takes one, doesn't it? And there were always aggressive blokes in those gigs because, it was a place to get a drink at midnight on a Saturday night, and then they discovered it was £2 a pint even then, and that was enough to turn them on the comics. So they weren't pleasant days at all. I wouldn't wish them back upon myself, but I'm glad I did it.
It affected your style?
Well, I've sort of retrospective. As I said earlier, I'm not remotely reflective. I don't think things through. I don't know why I do things or why I appear the way I do, but I've had to ask myself, why is it that so many people thought I was aggressive and bombastic and overly opinionated when I didn't think I was really, and I don't think my friends thought I was. So I had to sort of look at it, and I had to sort of think, well, maybe it's because that's what I looked like on stage. And why did that occur? And I think it's out of the fear. I often used to use the term, I've lived in the shadow of the gong for 10 years, because the Comedy Store had this gong which was banged when the audience got too baying. I was never gonged off, and when I became the compere, I had the gong in my hand. And it was a horrible time. I mean, kind of...
Did you gong other people off?
Occasionally, one had to, because they were just dying and the evening was going down the pan. But this sort of gladiatorial approach to comedy is not the friend of good, subtle comedy at all. I mean, it took anyone who could get away with the subtle stuff was really good. I remember Jenny and Dawn, French and Saunders, wouldn't play the Comedy Store, and rightly so. Why would they? Why would they go on stage in order to be shouted at about their tits and things? And, what's the point? And it was hard on the quieter acts, and I became a loud act very, very quickly.
I remember going to the comics strip myself, looking for talent for Channel 4, which was starting up in those days, and wondering whether I'd ever get away on television with the acts that I was seeing on stage. Did you have to tone it down a bit to get onto telly?
You had to change it. I never felt I toned down the reality of my act. I feel the passion and the content remained unchanged for the TV. I've often been invited by journalists to kind of to use a modern word, disrespect the BBC. Surely you were censored. Surely Channel 4 Saturday Live, used to work for you, must have censored you. No, never. I actually think the powers that be in British broadcasting on the whole are men and women of goodwill. I mean, they have certain responsibilities, and those include not offending half the country whilst delighting the other half, etc. But if you're clever and if you're not overly precious, you can find a way. So you don't swear. It's a great discipline not to swear. I appreciate the fact that television told me not to, because it meant I learnt that you didn't have to necessarily. Political points, you're told you can't name McDonald's. All right, well, we'll say a well-known clown burger chain or what. You can find your way around. I used to have to do my acting when I was working for you. I used to have to do my act to a lawyer each Saturday, which was a horrible experience because the lawyer never laughed. But you always found a way around. You can't say that. Well, can I say that? Yeah, sort of. So no, I don't feel my act was ever toned down for the telly, but I certainly changed it in order to make it work on the telly.
Which comedians did you most admire?
Well,
do you most admire?
I'm not a comedy obsessive in any sense. I don't seek out comedy as entertainment any more than I would any other form of entertainment. But I do love good comedy. I mentioned Morecambe and Wise as perhaps the greatest variety act in my experience. I also loved Dad's Army at the time. Anything that's any good, Fawlty Towers. I think perhaps the greatest figure working in comedy today is Woody Allen. To me, it's sort of obvious. The good stuff is clear. But sometimes I surprise people when I say I can see good stuff where they don't. For instance, a man like Bruce Forsyth, to me, is clearly a superb raconteur and communicator. Michael Barrymore, I watch with great delight. It's not what I do, and I wouldn't watch it every week, but I enjoy very skilled comic muses going about their business, and it doesn't have to be my area. I love what's going on currently. I mean, I think the greatest sitcom that's come out of the 90s is Ab Fab, and I think perhaps the best new variety perhaps would be Vic and Bob, but there's so much else going on. I think it's a healthy time.
In your writing, can you do things in a novel that you can't do in other forms?
Well, certainly. I mean, novel writing and perhaps radio are the only creative forms for me that have no budgetary constraints. Obviously, you can go anywhere and you can do anything, which is why my novels, early novels particularly, included whole colonies being set up on the moon in order to avoid environmental Armageddon on Earth, etc. And in gridlock, I had the whole of London completely gridlocked with no traffic moving for sort of 50 square miles. These things would be tough to film. So one's imagination can run riot, but that isn't always necessarily a good thing. I appreciate parameters. I think discipline in life is very important. I think rules are important, not because they're made to be broken, but they are made to be circumnavigated, occasionally broken, often appreciated, and go a different way. Budgetary restraints, linguistic restraints, the restraint of form can create better art. A good example perhaps would be Blackadder, in that the first series of Blackadder, which I didn't work on but I appreciated very much, but was considered something of a curate's egg. And I think one of the problems with it was that, very honourably, they were trying to make a comedy on film, and it was vast. I mean, John Lloyd brilliantly said, well, it was marvellous, it looked $1 million, unfortunately it cost $2 million. It was comedy on film, no audience, a lot of wide shots, etc. And it didn't really work entirely. And for the second series, which Richard and Curtis and I wrote, we decided to really change things completely. Let's forget the budget, let's forget the set, let's get into a studio, 2 sets, 2 wooden cardboard sets, because the money is there, as they say in Hollywood. What's the money? The money is Rowan's face, the money is Miranda and Stephen and Hugh and etc. And so actually the constraints made a much tighter. It gave us the opportunity to develop dialogue and offer opportunities to the actors to do facial gymnastics. I used to say Rowan falling off a horse at 200 metres is no funnier than anyone else falling off a horse. But Rowan at 2 feet is just about the funniest thing you could ever see.
Politically, in Saturday Night Live, you had a fairly consistent go at Mrs. Thatcher. Mm-hmm. You're a great friend of Neil Kinnock's. What do you make of Tony Blair as a subject for comedy?
Well, it's not about the Tony Blair, it's about policy, it's about what happens. So it's early days at the moment. I feel if I was on television now, I certainly would not have let what seems to me the dismantling of one of the pillars of the welfare state, which is the legal aid system. I would not have let that go. If I was doing live comedy now, I believe I would be writing a fairly passionate but funny routine about it. I claim that all the jokes I made about Thatch and Normo Tebbs and Edwina were all funny. And if they weren't funny, I wouldn't have been paid and you would have had me sacked. I was a comedian. But what I find strange is that I was sort of criticised as a young man on live television on the alternative channel, Channel 4, and I was still criticised for taking an anti-government view. There was a tremendous orthodoxy in those days that Thatcher was improving Britain. And I think the job of the comedian is to look sideways and to avoid the orthodoxy. And one thing that one mustn't forget is whatever one says about the current government, times have changed. There is a much closer consensus. Major and Blair are so much closer than Thatcher and Kinnock or Thatcher and Foote were. Don't forget, the 80s was an extraordinary time. When I first became a comedian, the first night I was a comedian, there were riots in London. Riots. I'm not talking about a few street fights. Riots. Riots in Bristol, in St Paul's. Oh no, I'm talking about the early inner city riots of 81 and 82. Brixton in flames, Glasgow, Manchester, St Paul's, and this was an extraordinary time. There was the post-war consensus was being shattered, and within another year we were at war. We had a war. A couple of years after that we had the most bitter and divisive strike in history, where the police were pitted against an entire workforce, the miners' strike, followed by the Wapping disputes. These were exciting times. Whatever your political associations and affiliations, one could not avoid the drama of the age. I mean, from the anti-Nazi League riots, festivals of the late 70s, right through the 80s, it was a political decade, and obviously that affected me very deeply. I think people forget just how confrontational things were.
As a writer and performer, you're on a roll. Does anything frighten you?
Professionally or personally?
Personally.
I don't tend to dwell. I mean, I'm not unaware of the appalling problems we face environmentally. I think the thing that worries me most is that the only true form of government to me is democratic government, and that means elections, and that's the only way we can run our planet in a civilized manner. And that means elections every 5 years, because if you have only every 50 years, you might as well have a dictatorship. But the problems of the world are long-term, and I feel where democracy must mature is in viewing the long term, because I think both on left and right, and they're both very close to the middle now, we tend to have a sort of Democratic-Republican situation at the moment, everybody's looking to the next election. And we cannot defend the ozone layer, and we cannot reduce global warming if we are looking only to the next election. And I think democracy will mature when we achieve some form of consensus on global issues. I mean, both left and right always agreed we didn't want to have a nuclear war. Can't we have a similar consensus on the environment? Can't we say, look, we all know that cutting hydrocarbons is going to affect jobs, but if we all agree to make that a consensus and find jobs elsewhere and not play each other off against. So if you're in opposition and the government in power is trying to do something about the environment, you don't knock them for it because there maybe is a short-term job loss. I don't know, there's no time to discuss this now, but I do fear for the environmental consequences of the free market. The free market is established, and it is the way to run the world. We can't have controlled economies. The excesses of Russia seem to prove that, of the Soviet Union. But you can't leave the environment up to the free market. That's why we have government, and government must act responsibly, and that means a consensus.
And Sir Ian McKellen goes face-to-face next Monday. It's at the same time here on BBC 2 at 11:15.